Hey you guys, Siobhan here, just dropping in before the next episode of Knowing Animals. The episode you're about to hear was recorded in Mexico City where I attended the Minding Animals conference, but we've got a brand new sponsor for the program that I wanted to tell you about before I start the episode proper. So this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by the podcast Species. Now, I know that you're interested in animals because you're listening to the podcast Knowing Animals, and I also know that you're interested in podcasts because you're listening to one. So why not check out the new podcast Species? Each week, Species considers a different animal, and you get an opportunity to learn all about that animal, how they live, their cultural significance, whether they're endangered, and much more. I've been listening to the podcast and enjoying it a great deal. Did you know that there were never any snakes in Ireland? I've also been learning about our very own Australian Tasmanian devil. So the program does a different species every week, and it also travels around the world. How do you find out about the podcast Species? You can go to anywhere where you normally get your podcast from, including the iTunes store, or you can just simply put Species, the podcast, into Google and it would come up right away. So, learn more about animals with a different species each week via the podcast Species. And enjoy the program.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey you guys, welcome to Knowing Animals, the podcast. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. Now this episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by our friends at ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA is the membership group for animal artists, animal advocates, and animal activists. Have I said academics yet? And of course, animal studies scholars. ASA brings together all these people and does a lot to promote things such as conferences, funding opportunities, books, special issues in journals, calls for papers. It's all on their Facebook page, but ASA needs your membership dollars as well. It's only 50 Australian dollars to become a member of ASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association, so please think about joining today. Well, this episode of Knowing Animals is coming to you from Minding Animals, which is being held in Mexico City. I'm very lucky to be joined today by Ralph R. Acampora, we were just practicing his surname, I got a little nod then, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Hofstra University. And today we're going to discuss Ralph's book, Corporal Compassion, Animal Ethics and Philosophy of Body, which was published in 2006 by Pittsburgh Press. Welcome to the podcast, Ralph.
It's a great chance to be here with you, and I'm very honored and humbled by it.
Oh, thank you, Ralph. So could you start by telling us why you wrote this book?
Let's see. I suppose what happened for me was that I had a pre-existing interest in animals, and then early on in my life, and then it became intellectualized early in my school life, say secondary school and then on to college. And I made it the subject of my grad school endeavors. And the book is a way of putting together a few ideas that are not normally given sway in animal ethics. So it proceeds from the basis of a continental European approach. It also matters that I want to throw some monkey wrenches into the thick of things, learning more about how different animals manifest themselves in a bodily way and how that comports with our own sense of body. So instead of so much interest on mind and morality, I'm looking at the connection between experiences of embodiment and how that plays to our sense of obligation, protection of vulnerability, things of this sort.
Wonderful. So, Ralph, there's a lot in what you just said there. And as I mentioned to you last night at the conference dinner, when I read your book, I found it very challenging because it used a lot of vocabulary that I'm not terribly confident with. And it's a very sophisticated book. So let's try and break down a few of those issues for the listeners. Can you tell us what kind of philosophy deals with the body and how you're using it in relation to animals?
Yes, probably the premier thinker in this regard is Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who dedicated his career towards figuring out and in some cases creating categories to make sense of bodily experience, and has even more phrases and technical terms up his sleeve than I do. So I was trying to cut down, but maybe not enough happened, and I'm glad to talk a little bit about untying the knots of the vocabulary and technical jargon. Probably the biggest one is actually a German distinction that we don't or can't make in English. And it's the difference between the live body, which is referred to in German as Leib, and the inert thing-like bodies of ordinary objects that aren't alive, furniture and so forth, and things of this matter. And that would be referred to as Körper, obviously sounding a little bit like a dwelling or something having to do with the corporeal that can register even in human bodies. Say the medical doctor has to pay attention to your corporeal experience of your body, whereas someone who's looking like a philosopher at your existential experiences of yourself is more apt to be concerned with the living or live body. This gives them a sense or a way of getting entry into some rather, maybe we should say intimate details of people's lives, but I don't necessarily mean anything erotic or special or technical. One way to describe in a very accessible way the lived body is to talk about or reference the way we park cars. So if we're on a street and we come up in a car that we're driving and we want to park in a parallel fashion to all the others on the street, we have to get into a mode or frame of reference where our body boundaries are bigger than our physical station in life. And in some ways, your embodiment takes over the dimensions of the car itself, and you feel as if the edges of the car are the edges of you and your body. In fact, you can't park well unless you master this kind of skill.
Ralph, how then is that principle applied to the lives of, say, non-human animals?
Right. Well, there are a few different ways in which this goes. It's part of a longer idea I had in writing the book. That is to say, I felt it necessary to not only talk about the ethics of the animal situations I was describing, but to ground the ethics in axiology, study of value more generally, and behind even that in ontology. So there's a chapter in the book on each one of these, ontology, axiology, ethics, and then beyond that, applied ethics. And I want to show how it would work out in some detail. And the areas I chose for the different applications were lab animals, and in particular rats and rodents and things of this sort. And I also found it interesting to take a look at the zoo as a site of captivity and what that meant in a phenomenological sense.
And so what do your findings then impose upon us in terms of our duties towards animals, if that's an appropriate vocabulary within this school of philosophy?
Right. So one thing that turns out in the case of the lab animals is a greater sensibility to which they are being objectified or reified into something that's almost not even alive, but is more looked at more as a specimen of something inert, part of a scientific research regimen, and a specimen of sorts of a certain kind of being. The other things that, excuse me.
Please.
The other sorts of things that this is helpful for is to get a sense of a well-rounded life that has to do not only with what is sometimes called the ghost in the machine, as if you've got this flighty little supernatural nugget called a mind that is squirreled away somewhere in your skull. And the best answers we get on this include historical ones from Descartes and the pineal gland and so forth. And instead of going that route is to open up the categories and dimensions of experience to include embodiment. Embodiment even I have some problems with, but I fear I might make things even more difficult if we get into that.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate your efforts to simplify for my benefit and for the benefit of the listeners who aren't familiar with philosophy, particularly, I guess, the continental traditions. But please keep going. What else does your theory impose upon us in terms of the requirements of how we interact with the non-humans?
Right. Now, I would say to interact with others is the essential aspect of our socializing. It gives us a chance to understand the other in a way maybe that's not always available when we approach it through other means or modes. And so one of the things that comes up in the zoo application is it tells us we shouldn't be ready to determine what a being is or how it is or why it is just on the basis of corporeal information, that we need also corporal information, that meaning what's referred to in the lived body, the live body, sometimes referred to as Leib, for which we have no real equivalent in English, but they do in German, and they use it to make these distinctions that we're talking about. So I'd say one of the things that's most useful in making this transition is the notion that you can have a experience of a being that doesn't reduce it to an object. In existential philosophy, some of the bigwigs, figures like Jean-Paul Sartre and others of his way of entangling and disentangling human experience make it seem like it's so difficult to be in touch with other people and other animals even more so. So I'll just start from the people. First of all, he's notorious, Sartre is, for saying that other people are hell, or hell is other people, on the notion that we all tend to scrutinize each other and label and box each other in various categories that reduce us to something that we're not entirely. And the embodied way of looking at ethics and morality seeks to overcome this problem and make things more accessible for people to discuss their challenges, but also their joys and not just sufferings, although suffering plays a big part of it. In particular, the messages of vulnerability we give forth and take in as let's say human beings, or any being with finitude, ultimately mortal, but also vulnerable in a physical and bodily way.
Well, Ralph, it strikes me that your approach to the animal question and philosophy and considering morality and ethics is quite distinctive compared to a lot of the philosophy that I get exposed to as someone in animal studies. I'm wondering, how has your book been received, and can you see your theories influencing animal studies more generally?
It's interesting. The reception of my book has occurred on several different levels, and in some cases there's been an ignoring of its publication, to the point where I just had a review 10 years, 11 years after publication. It was a positive one. And then the earlier review I had just a few years after it came out was people working in a part of philosophy that's often confused with psychology. It's phenomenological. Phenomenology done in a certain heavy-duty technical way can very much resemble psychology, and has a lot of people in psychology developing it over the past half century or so. And those folks seem to take to it very well. Likewise, the Italians made a wonderful reception for it, to the point of maybe 5 years out, publishing a translation into Italian. So when I went to Italy, I had the chance to sign people's books that they had of it, and so forth and so on, and that was very nice. But I stray a bit. I think you had another idea up your sleeve when you first asked the last question. Do you recall?
I was wondering how it's been received and whether you can see it influencing animal studies scholarship.
Yeah, the influence on animal studies. There has been some, particularly international and overseas. A Polish critic now talks about the moral experience of other animals as being rooted in a corporal sort of mix of, or dimension of experiences. And I'm trying to think who else. Oh, the critical animal studies folks like it a lot, because the applied chapters were fairly strong in their critique of zoos and laboratory situations.
Wonderful. Well, Ralph, I ask everybody who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
We'll see how quick they can be.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Let's see. I think it was something in the series of books that Peter Singer and Tom Reagan co-edited together early on in the late 70s, early 80s, that kind of thing. And close to it was Paul Taylor's environmental ethic that also served as an animal ethic. Respect for Nature, it was called. Yeah.
Wonderful. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Yes, I had put together a paper for presentation and eventually got published on what I called a Heideggerian eco-Sein. Now, Sein just means to be, or refers to being in German. And I found that there was enough going on in Heidegger to talk about the human existential position. I wanted to move on to the animal existential position, and I discovered that Heidegger didn't think much of the experience of animals. Eventually, several of scholars, including myself, Matt Calarco, and a number of others, got going on trying to unpack this. I think precisely because Heidegger didn't, and not because he did do it.
So, Ralph, if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, curiously enough, it probably would be Paul Shepard, who was something of an ecologist and moral thinker wrapped up into one, a real polyglot sort of person, methodologically could carry on in both the sciences and humanities as well. I found him very challenging, and it's not because I accept everything he says that I recognize him as being a big influence. It's precisely because I disagree with some big things of his that he's so influential on me.
Wonderful. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
Well, outside of classrooms, I think pushing these ideas of 1 or 2 days a week of vegetarianism, like meatless Mondays and so forth, I've been successful in moving that forward as a kind of co-curricular interest with various clubs on my campus. We're fortunate enough at Hofstra to have both animal welfare and animal rights represented by separate student clubs, and I'm the faculty advisor for both of those. And I like to think that with the faculty advice and guidance, more is getting done than elsewise would happen.
Fantastic. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human relationship, what would it be?
If I had the power, this is way out there, but as long as there are no limits on the power that comes forth from this hypothetical, I'd say that we somehow all could be autotrophs and not necessarily have to be heterotrophs.
Okay, you're going to have to explain to us what those words mean.
Yes, sure. Heterotrophs eat things other than their own species, and autotrophs make their own energy and nutrition like plants. So if animals, non-human and human, could carry on something analogous to photosynthesis, I think that would be very interesting for achieving things that you might call them prophets, sometimes scholars, just humanitarians, people like Albert Schweitzer really were pushing for.
Wonderful. So, Ralph, what are you working on next?
What I worked on just recently, and what I'm next trying to get published, I think I have a venue or a periodical in mind already, and it seems to be going well with them, is the idea of biophilia. Now, biophilia, the love of life, was most people who know it at all through the determinations and theorizing of one particular biologist. His name is E.O. Wilson, Edward Wilson. And Wilson thought that biophilia was an innate tendency in us, that we had a way of being drawn almost genetically to other forms, or we had something of an affinity, natural affinity for other forms of life. And obviously, he was a natural scientist, a social scientist by the name of Stephen Kellert, who worked at Yale and died just recently, developed the theory into more social scientific areas, psychology, sociology, and so forth. And the one who spent the most time on developing biophilia originally, say mid-century in the 40s, was a thinker that had some truck with the so-called Frankfurt School in Germany, a very culture-critical strand of intellectualizing. And his way of thinking about it was this idea that we could follow on from our interactions with other animals and their bodily scheme of things to almost I wouldn't know exactly how to put it, but maybe a sense of partnership or neighborliness would be most important to these folks.
Well, Ralph, it sounds like another complex piece of work, so we'll have to get you back for you to explain it to us all once it's finalised. How can people find out more about your work? Okay,
so there's a profile of me professionally on the Hofstra website. That's Hofstra for the institutional name, and then use my name as a secondary key term for searching Google or what have you. It might also be that now that I'm publishing in some electronic venues, that you can gain access, or more properly speaking, your institution that you're based at can gain access for you to some of what I've written in the past couple of years. I know that'll be true of the piece on biophilia that's coming out with Between the Species, an old and very sort of impressive journal that started in the mid-'80s in the San Francisco Bay Area, and then had some time off for a few years in the late 90s, and now has been taken over by a division of the Cal State system and is running fairly well. And I like, because it does animal philosophy not only in an ethical key, but also tied to epistemology, metaphysics, and other branches of the discipline.
Wonderful. Well, Ralph, thank you so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals, or you can like us at Facebook at Knowing Animals. Finally, please leave a review at iTunes. Reviews make it easier for other people to find us and to learn about animals and philosophy. My name's Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.